Well, welcome back to the 5W class. If you're joining us again this week, we're getting close to the end of our production season, so today may be our last video lesson. We'll see. We're getting close anyway. But as such, I brought my production team again just in case this was the last one. But I wanted to start out this morning talking about the fact that today we're going to move on from the book of Judges and Ruth, where we've been the last several weeks, into 1 Samuel. And so it's a really interesting part of history and a really interesting part of the time that we've been studying. And it's going to continue to give us even more insights into the 5 W's. Now, why do we do the 5 W's? The who, where, when, what, questions of science, and the why, questions of theology. The idea continues to be both for the believer to strengthen his viewpoint or to strengthen her connection to the Scripture, but also for the unbeliever and the very much the skeptic. We want to take and spend some analysis on the 4 W's, the science questions, and hopefully make the case for, if those are solid and those are showing signs that there's something going on here beyond just happenstance and just pure chance, then the skeptic has to also consider the Scripture in the bigger light, that maybe the theology is just as solid as the science. And so far that's what we've been doing for the last couple of weeks. Two big changes today, and one of them is the change of venue. If you'll notice on the screen when I'm in a different room, at least for a few moments, the change of venue for the clock. And the reason I wanted the clock in today's screen was we're getting ready to transition from where we've been since July of last year. We've covered from Genesis through Ruth, and each of the dates that we have used, and we have meticulously attempted to study the dates that the NIV scholars have put in place. But each of those dates were based upon a certain number of assumptions. The dates typically derived originally from what we're going to see in 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 1, I believe, and we'll see that in a couple of weeks. But it says at that point, this happened so many hundred years ago. All the dates that we have been using up until now were the best guess of scholars who are lifetime scholars. And so we've tried to follow that. What we're transitioning to today as we go into 1 Samuel is we're now going to enter a period for the remainder of our study for the next couple of years in the Bible of historically verifiable dates. So the dates now become not only dates that the Bible says are the way they are, but now we have other existing cultures, other existing peoples, their writings, their history, their annals, etc., that will corroborate the date lines that we're beginning to start establishing here today in the book of Samuel. So all that being said, the other major thing today that's going to take place, it's a shift, is that we're shifting from a time, we started with Genesis. They eventually ended up in Egypt for 430 years, then in Moses in the desert for 40 years, and in the book of Judges for a period of years, 300 plus or minus years. And I skipped Moses in there, Joshua in there too. There's a little period in between Moses and Judges that was Joshua. But today we transition to a place where the monarchy, the beginnings of a king on earth for the Israelites. Moses had anticipated that they would eventually ask for it. We're going to begin to see today in Samuel that it comes to take place. So I'll stop here. I'll give you one more little intervening slide on the history and where we are getting here, and then we'll take a look at a couple of slides this morning to get us started in Samuel. We'll be in Samuel for some time, so unlike where we've been in the past, we've been about 30 weeks, and we've covered all the way from Genesis to the Ruth. From now on, we'll be in Samuel probably a good 10 weeks, so stay tuned. There's a tremendous amount of information. Let's see what the science says. Let's see what it points to for the theology, and it will draw us closer, absolutely, like every piece of perfect Scripture there is. It will also help the skeptic to determine for him or her, whether or not there's something there for them to see. And my contention is that absolutely it is definitely worth their time and their consideration. What you see in front of you here is a slide that's been prepared to give you an idea where Samuel and the storyline that we'll be discussing over the next 10 weeks actually falls in history. And what you see is something we've discussed in class on multiple occasions, but I've tried to make it a nice, clean one-sheet piece of paper, and you can stop your screen in a minute and pause and look if you'd like. But it's basically the first 33 listed names in the genealogy of Jesus. You see in the top left corner, Adam's number 1, goes to the bottom down there. There's the 23rd generation of the 12 sons of Jacob. And then in the blue box at the top right's where we've been the last couple of weeks. Mostly we've been in Judges and Ruth. If you recall, last week the person who married Ruth was Boaz, and you'll see him highlighted there as number 30 in the genealogy of Jesus. Also, we'll pick up this week and start talking about Jesse and David in the book of Samuel. It'll actually show up in chapter 15 or 16 of Samuel, so we won't actually speak this morning, but I wanted to give you an idea where this story lies in the timeline overall and what perspective we should have. As you'll notice, there's been 32 generations of men prior to David and no king, so we're starting a brand new idea. And Samuel is going to usher in this new era of the monarchy. Okay, so let's switch over to our trademarked whiteboard 5 W's. And we've got the 5 W's of 1 and 2 Samuel. Who wrote this book is a guy possibly by the name of Zabud. Who is Zabud? We'll come back to that in a moment. Where that we're talking about Israel. Again, they've been here over 300 years now, and they've taken the majority of the land. So this is the land of Israel, Canaan, the promised land. The when, the events of both 1 and 2 Samuel cover a period of approximately 1105 to 980 BC, and it was written sometime after 930 BC. Again, I'll give you more detail on that in a moment. And the what, this is the story of Samuel, of the prophet Samuel, and he's getting ready to be the one who anoints the first King Saul and the second King David. And he will be there and give us all the insight on the birth of the monarchy. All right, let's take a quick look at the normal introductory notes that we have. And don't let me put you to sleep this morning or scare you to death. We're not going to cover this in detail today. We will use this throughout the remainder of the 10 weeks. Let me point out quickly just a handful of things as we get started. We mentioned Zabud might be the writer of the book of Samuel. Well, Zabud turns out to have been the personal advisor to King Solomon. This is about 3 generations down the path now. And he was also the son of Nathan the prophet, who was underneath King David. So that's where that's at. We will look at that in more detail later on in the study. Also, he lived sometime around that 930 period that we're talking about, and there'll be some reason to understand why they think he was the one most likely to be the author. Interestingly, whoever the author is, they choose not to start out with a birth narrative of either Saul or David, the first 2 kings, but instead, as we'll see this morning in chapters 1 through 3, the birth narrative that we're going to discuss is that of Samuel, the prophet, who's going to be the one that anoints both these new kings in the future. I think that the author is trying to accentuate the importance of Samuel in the coming events. And it's saying basically that flesh and blood, that of Saul and David, is subordinate to spirit. And so he's trying to establish a pattern for what's to come in the kingship. Lastly, there's just a couple of just fun notes. 1 and 2 Samuel, which we'll see together, obviously, were actually written as one book. We'll discuss why that is maybe when we get to 2 Samuel in a couple of weeks. And so we're going to just start today with the beginnings of the portrayal of the kingship coming into Israel. It starts with Samuel the prophet, and we'll go through Saul and David over the next few weeks. I'm sure by now you guys probably think that I think I'm getting paid by the number of charts and papers I produce each week, but that is not the case, and we will not use this morning. We will use it later on during the next 10 weeks. I want to introduce it. It's our normal timeline. You can see that 1 and 2 Samuel covers about 125 years. It's stuck between the book of Ruth and 1 Kings. And also this, if you'll notice at the very far right, the 2 little squiggly lines, this is one of 3 pages. I will not show you pages 2 and 3 this morning, but there's a whole lot of stuff going on in Samuel. I just want to introduce the idea that it's a very dense book with a tremendous amount of information, and we're going to have all kinds of fun over the next 10 weeks. So hang on, and more to come. In the final picture for today, take a quick look at the tribe area of Ephraim. You'll notice it in the top left center of the screen. Notice the town Shiloh just above the M in Ephraim. And today, a good bit of our storyline is going to happen there. Okay, so we just finished all our looking at our slides, and now we're getting to the good stuff. And we're going to jump into the first 3 chapters of the book of Samuel. And hopefully what we just covered gives us some perspective, so as we go forward, it makes more sense as we're moving along. Today's story starts with a couple of players, and the players are, there's a man from the city of Ramah, which is just close to the little city of Shiloh I showed on the map. And he and his 2 wives every year go up to Shiloh to make their offering. So he has 2 wives. One of them's name is Peninnah, and the other's name is Hannah. So today's story is going to be mostly about Hannah, and her child will be born. So Peninnah has children, and Hannah does not. And that creates a little tension in the family where Hannah feels less than, and Peninnah feels a little superior, and we'll see in a second she treats her poorly, as families sometimes do. But there's also a couple other people that we're going to start the story with today. So the main player was Elkanah, was the man from Ramah. He was married to 2 ladies, Peninnah and Hannah. Now when they go to Shiloh each year, Shiloh is where the tabernacle is located. And if you recall from Joshua chapter 18, whenever Joshua was doling out the land and allotting it to the last 7 tribes, they moved the tabernacle to Shiloh. So the tabernacle has been sitting in this location approximately 300 years. So everybody now knows for the last 300 years when you go to make your offerings, the tabernacle's in Shiloh. So when they go there, the priest at the moment is a guy named Eli. And Eli has 2 sons, one of them named Hophni and one named Phinehas. And that's the same name as the high priest that had been under Eleazar back 300 years prior, but not the same person. So don't get those 2 confused. So he has 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas. So that gives you the players, and that's going to cover all of this chapter 1. Now, I mentioned a second ago that Peninnah was not the most kind-hearted lady to her fellow wife, Hannah. I guess there's some rivalry in the house, whatever. But it says in one of these verses, and I'm going to find it here, says, for her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. So Peninnah was provoking Hannah over the fact that Hannah had no children and Peninnah had children. So each year, as they went to Shiloh, Hannah would become upset the fact that she was there and Peninnah was saying these things to her, and also the fact that when she got there she had no child. So she would become distressed, and Elkanah would say something to the effect, honey, you've got me, and I'm as good as any 10 sons. You just have to be content. Well, Hannah decides one year in one of these pilgrimages that she is going to go to the tabernacle and pray over the fact that she's yet to have a son. So she shows up at the tabernacle, and of course Eli, the priest, happens to be there sitting at the front of the tabernacle. Now she goes to this location and she begins to pray earnestly. As you can imagine, this has been going on for years, so she's built up, and there's a lot of pent-up anxiety and frustration, I'm sure. So she's praying with some seriousness and taking it as serious as she can possibly do so, and so Eli's beginning to pick up something's going on here. Now he misinterprets it a little bit. Let me see what else it says. It says, she says to praying before the Lord, O Lord Almighty, if you will only look upon your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head. Now the implication there, if you recall from Numbers, I think chapter 6, the Nazirite vow, and the implications, if you recall from the story of Samson just 2 or 3 weeks ago, when somebody was dedicated in their culture, one of the things they did was they didn't cut their hair. So she's saying basically, Lord, if you will let me have a son, I will dedicate this child to you, and we'll never cut his hair. He will be yours forever. Now, most of the time, those vows were for a period of time, for a year or 6 months or 2 weeks. But Hannah's saying, I'm going to give this child, Lord, to you if you provide him for me. Now, like I said, Eli has been watching this all along, and he comes to the conclusion that Hannah's drunk. He thinks because she's praying so earnestly, and I think it says that she prayed, her mouth moving without the words coming out, so she's just exhausted praying, God, please let me have a child. Eli says something to the fact, said Eli thought she was drunk, and he said to her, how long will you keep on getting drunk? Get rid of your wine. But Hannah replied, said, I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of my great anguish and great grief. So Eli says, once he realizes what's going on, young lady, I'm so sorry. Go in peace. I hope the Lord will grant you what you've come to ask for. Well, as it turns out, it says, so in the course of time, Hannah goes home, her and Elkanah, because like I said, this was 3 times a year they'd come to a festival there at the tent of the tabernacle, the tent of meeting. So they've gone home, and it says, in the course of time, Hannah conceived and gave birth to a son, and she named him Samuel, saying, because I asked the Lord for him. Now, let me just stop just quickly to give you a little side note there. The name Samuel means heard of God, like heard. God heard Hannah's cry, and thus she named Samuel the name that implies God heard my cry. The Hebrew people, guys, and we do this ever so often, but and I stop every so often and say this, as we continue to go through the study, I have been amazed how deep and how insightful, how thoughtful the people that are Hebrew were in the names of their children, their parents, the places they go. These were a deep, thoughtful, incredibly insightful bunch of people. So Samuel's name means God heard me, and this is exactly what's getting ready to take place. Says next, when the man Elkanah then went up with his family to offer the annual sacrifice to the Lord and to fulfill his vow, this is the next year coming, he asked Hannah, said, honey, do you want to go back with me? Now, they've got the baby now. And she says, no. Said, I tell you what I'm going to do. Said, I'm going to stay home with the baby until he's weaned, and when he's weaned, then I'll go back and I will give him to the high priest, or to the priest, Eli, at the tabernacle. So she's saying all along, I'm going to keep him until he's old enough. Now, in today's world, and I'm no expert, it's been 26 years since I've had a child in my house, but weaning a child is probably around the year mark. In those days, think about this, no refrigerator, no ice box, no powdered milk. The timeline was a little longer to wean a child. So we're probably saying, or the scholars that I'm reading here in the NIV study Bible are saying that this is probably about 3 years past before she ends up taking the child, Samuel, back to the tabernacle to be given to them to use as a servant, if you will, for the remainder of his life. So it says here toward the end of the chapter, about verse 24, it says, after he was weaned, she took the boy with her, young as he was. She also takes a sacrifice of a bull, some flour, and some wine. And it says, and they brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh. So again, they're taking him back to Shiloh where the tabernacle resides. It said, when they had slaughtered the bull, they brought the boy to Eli, the priest. And she said to him, as surely as you live, my Lord, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. In other words, do you remember me? Several years ago, you thought I was drunk in the temple or in the tabernacle, but I was praying, and this is the result of that prayer. It says, I prayed for a child, and the Lord has granted me what I ask of him. And I love that verse on a personal note because when my child was born in 1994, a gentleman handed me this verse, and it has had implications throughout her life and mine. So it's a wonderful verse. It says, I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I ask of him. And the final verse here says, so now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life he will be given over to the Lord. Okay, so as we begin chapter 2, Hannah and Elkanah had just dropped off Samuel with Eli. Now, Hannah then goes on to sing a song of praise. And the next 10 verses, chapter 2, verses 1 through 10, are a beautiful song. You know, last week I talked about how Ruth was a wonderful example for females and males. Hannah's right there with her. And I won't read these this morning, but I would ask that maybe you give that some consideration to read after the lesson today. These first 10 verses show that she was a remarkably thoughtful young lady that saw a lot of things very clearly, and we can all use that in our lives. But she sings her song for the first 10 verses, and then she and Elkanah go back home to Ramah. Now, you hope when you drop your children off with somebody, especially when you've dropped them off with the church, in this case, or at least something like that, that they're being taken care of well and that they're going to be just fine. And here we have, we've dropped off Samuel with Eli and his two sons, Hophni and Phinehas. Now, it turns out that the two boys of Eli are not such great role models. In fact, they're quite evil men, and we're going to see the repercussions of that. In those days, and in all days, if you recall, Moses had given directions in, I think, Leviticus chapter 7 about what portion of the animal that the priest was to receive after an offering. But what Hophni and his brother Phinehas were doing, instead they were going to the person who was slaughtering an offering, and they were saying to him, hey, I want the ribs, bring them to my house. Oh, I want some steaks tomorrow night, you bring that to my house. Hey, Wednesday we want roast, make sure you cut that piece out first. And instead of following the Levitical law, which God had for a purpose, they were picking and choosing the best for themselves and being very disrespectful. It says on, and I think about verse 17 of chapter 2, says, the sin of these young men was very great in the Lord's sight, for they were treating the Lord's offering with contempt. It says, but Samuel himself, the boy, was ministering before the Lord, wearing a linen ephod, and each year his mother made him a little robe and took it to him when he went up with her, when she went up with her husband to offer the annual sacrifice. So Samuel's being seen by Mama every year, but in the remainder of the year, he's around some guys that are not the most wholesome characters. Now, Eli is finding out about his boys from the people around him. You know, people talk, and obviously when you brought your offering to the tabernacle and somebody did something odd about it, it's probably big news, and it was to them. So the people had let Eli know what's going on. It says, now Eli, who was very old, heard about everything his sons were doing at all Israel. Now, let me stop here. If they were just doing this, it was an awful, atrocious act. But that was not all they were doing, too. He goes on to say, and how they slept with the women who served at the entrance to the tent of meeting. So you've got the people who are making the curtains and the cleaning lady and everybody else that works around the maintenance of the tabernacle. And Hophni and Phinehas are having illicit affairs out of marriage with the women that are serving. So not only were they taking the best meat, but they were also being very wrong in their behavior toward the people around them, especially the women. So a man comes through town, who it says is a man of God. A prophet comes and he tells Eli, you realize this is going to go poorly for you and your family. Says, you know, God took care of you guys from the beginning. He made the priesthood for a purpose, and here you're basically corrupting it. He says, God said through this prophet to Eli, said, why do you honor your sons more than me by fattening yourselves on the choice parts of every offering made by my people Israel? It says, therefore the Lord, the God of Israel, declares, I promised that your house and your father's house would minister before me forever. But now the Lord declares, far be it from me. Those who honor me I will honor, but those who despise me will be disdained. God's getting ready to tell Eli, just because you're from the house of Aaron doesn't mean a thing. There's other people from the house of Aaron, and you and your boys are going to come to a very tough end, and that your line is going to have an incredibly difficult time throughout history. We will see that perpetuate throughout the book of Samuel. I won't go further here, but stay tuned. That's a storyline that continues to go on. It goes on, it says, and what happens to your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, will be a sign to you that they will both die on the same day. And I will raise up for myself a faithful priest who will do according to what is in my heart and my mind. I will firmly establish his house, and he will minister before my anointed one always. So chapter 3 begins with the idea that now the boy Samuel has been ministering for some period of time. He's now somewhat older than 3. So for our discussion, our thought process, this young boy, 12 years old or so, it says, has ministered before the Lord under Eli. It says, in those days, the word of the Lord was rare. Now, if you recall, we're at the tip end of the period of Judges. We're about the time Jephthah and Samson were judges. So this is going on parallel in this little town of Ramah and in Shiloh. So if you recall also in our study of the 12 judges, there was only a handful of times God actually spoke and intervened. Well, we're getting ready to see that change this morning through the life and the ministry of Samuel. So one night, Eli, now a very aged gentleman, is laying in his normal place in the tabernacle sleeping. And it says the lamp of God had not yet gone out, which that means, if you recall, they lit a lamp all night long as part of the Levitical practice. So it's saying that this is in the wee hours of the morning. The lamp hadn't quite gone out yet, but we're probably talking 3 or 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. It said, then the Lord called to Samuel. So Samuel, a kid, hears a voice calling to him at night, says, hey, Samuel. And Samuel wakes up and goes to Eli, his priest and his mentor, and he says, Eli, did you call me? And Eli says, son, go back to sleep. You're dreaming. So he does it again, and the same thing happens. And he does it a third time, and the same thing happens, except by the third time, old Eli now is starting to recognize, wait a second, I think God may be trying to speak to Samuel. So he says to Samuel, you go back to bed. He said, but this time, if God calls to you, you need to say, Lord, here I am. I want to hear what you've got to say. In fact, it says, then Eli realized the Lord was calling the boy. So Eli told Samuel, go and lie down, and if he calls you, say, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. So the Lord came back a fourth time. And on this fourth time, he speaks to Samuel. And this time, Samuel, again, a young boy, realizes it's Lord God speaking to him, so he's listening. Now, God has given Samuel some pretty rough news to start out with. The very first time he talks to me, he said, see, I'm about to do something in Israel that will make the ears of everyone who hears it tingle. At that time, I will carry out against Eli everything I spoke against his family, from beginning to end. For I told him that I would judge his family forever because of the sin he knew about. His sons made themselves contemptible, and he failed to restrain them. Therefore I swore to the house of Eli, the guilt of Eli's house will never be atoned for by sacrifice or offering. So God has said to Samuel, your mentor and the priest Eli has made some really bad mistakes. Your 2 other priests, his sons, your companions in the ministry, Hophni and Phinehas, they've done some really bad things, and the time's coming that they're getting ready to pay for it. So he sends Samuel back, goes back to sleep, wakes up the next morning. Now Eli recognized that something took place big overnight, and he goes to Samuel and he says, son, can you tell me what God has said to you? Now, I can only imagine the angst that Samuel felt, but it says he was afraid to tell Eli because the message he's going to give Eli is not a good one. It said, so Samuel told him everything and hiding nothing from him. And Eli said, he is the Lord, let him do what is good in his eyes. So it says the Lord was with Samuel as he grew up, and he let none of his words fall to the ground. And all of Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, remember Dan was in the top, Beersheba's in the bottom, that means all of Israel, recognized that Samuel was attested as a prophet of the Lord. And the last verse I want to leave you with, but the one that's going to be great for us as we keep going forward, it says, the Lord continued to appear at Shiloh, and there he revealed himself to Samuel through his word. The Lord continued to appear to Samuel. We're going to see that Samuel is going to get some incredibly good information from God, and then what it's going to do both for him and the people around him and for the monarchy. So stay tuned. The book of Samuel is getting ready to be just as good as all the ones we've already done. All right, as we end up today's lesson, just wanted to kind of close out a couple of final thoughts. As you can see, the entire production team is here. We started back in, I think, the 19th of March, and it's now May the 4th. Let's finish a few notes on Samuel. Samuel, as we saw in his birth narrative, is going to be somebody special. God's going to talk to him throughout, and we're going to see some great things because of that. He's going to tell us the stories, or he's going to be the one that actually anoints the first King Saul and anoints the next King David, and that's going to run the entirety of 1 and 2 Samuel and keep us real busy through the entire summer. I think it's going to be at least 10 weeks. But that being said, we wanted to finish today with this. We think this is probably the end of our season 1 of the 5W class. And we want to thank you so much for joining us. And again, it's been a team effort. We're going to switch possibly in transition here in May, depending on what the governor of North Carolina says and depending on what the church says. We're going to switch in transition possibly to live classes again because I miss you guys. I miss the questions and I miss the interaction. So we'll not be doing videos, at least in the short term. We may go to something, either a Zoom platform, which is the church is using already, or a WebEx platform that our Sunday school class has been using. And we just want to thank you again and invite you, if you've been watching these videos and you happen to be anywhere in North Carolina close to us, we'd love to have you. Come see us. Our class is not one that's exclusive in any way. Our class is everybody all the time is welcome, no matter what. And no matter what you believe or what your situation, we would love to have you.
Yes.
Any final thoughts from you?
Yes, when we do return back to the church, we want to try to do it a little differently, kind of ease us all into it so we feel comfortable being there. If it's pretty the first few weeks, we were thinking we would like to be maybe out in the church parking lot in the back there behind where the bus is. It should be a little shady. And we have plenty of chairs at church that we can meet for our Sunday school class time at least. If it happens to be too hot or if it's rainy, then we have been offered the big Sunday school class in the back of the building, which would help our class as well, so that hopefully those of us that have underlying health issues as we're coming back into being closer together would feel more comfortable in being together like that. So we're going to try to make it as safe as we can for everyone and to help everyone to feel comfortable as we slowly get back to a hopefully somewhat normal routine together.
Well, until then, know that you're loved, know that you're
Yes.
thought about, prayed for, and know that we would covet having you with us anytime and any place. God bless you. Thank you very much for supporting us, for the encouragement. It's been wonderful. And I look very much forward to us interacting, whether it's digitally or in person, interacting again on the Sunday school lesson.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a blessed day.